Hello, this is Stephen Wallace, and this is my presentation on bread. I'm going to start with part one, where I deal with bread in the ancient world, mostly. There will be another part where I deal with bread in the modern world, especially France, Germany, and the United States. But this is part one. Here's some information about me. The short version of this is after college and military service, I went to Cornell University. I got a PhD in linguistics. I taught that subject for several years. I then went to law school and I worked for several decades as a corporate lawyer. I'm now retired. That's what I look like. All right, bread. We're going to start with the beginning of agriculture. As a matter of fact, agriculture in the world did not just begin in one place, but the place that's shown here on the map is one of the places that's important that I'm going to focus on. It goes from Mesopotamia in the east, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is now in Iraq, to the eastern Mediterranean and then the Nile Valley. Agriculture in this area began maybe 10,000 years ago. Some early crops were grains. These were the domestication of wild grasses, in particular millet and barley and wheat. People learned to consume these grains. One way was in the form of porridge, that is, taking the grain and processing it and maybe roasting it and combining it with water and mixing it up. It's the ancestor of today's oatmeal and cream of wheat. They also learned to process the grains into flour, which they mixed with water and maybe a little salt and formed flatbreads or cakes, which they cooked over an open fire, maybe on a hot flat stone. Baking bread as we know it, that is, in the form of a raised loaf, began in Egypt around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. This relies first on the process of fermentation. Fermentation happens when yeast, which is a type of fungus, interacts with the natural sugars in grain to produce ethanol, which is a type of alcohol, which we don't have to worry about. It sort of burns off when the bread is baked. And carbon dioxide, the gas. Well, it's the carbon dioxide that's important here because as this gas is produced, it's trapped in the dough, this combination of flour and water, and the bubbles of gas cause the dough to expand. We say the dough rises. Now, how did people come across this? Probably originally by accident. Somebody left some dough outside and natural spores of yeast in the air landed on it and caused it to rise. And people just learned about this and over the course of centuries. And that's how they were able to get dough to rise in the form of a loaf of bread. And they didn't go to the grocery store and buy a package of Fleischmann's yeast. They took the dough from one loaf, or a little bit of it, and used it as a starter for the next loaf, and so on and so on and so forth. Well, the other thing that's important in the production of bread is the oven, because the traditional risen loaf, you can't really produce that on an open flame. So you have to have an enclosed, heated space with radiant heat. So the history of ovens is sort of long and complicated and murky, but in any event, by this time in Egypt, people had developed enclosed, heated spaces where they could bake bread. Then we had the relationship between bread and beer. I call this the dynamic duo. They are strongly related because they both involve the fermentation of grains. And in fact, we have some historical reports of the relationship here. There was an ancient Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, who made some comments about the Gauls. Those are the ancestors of today's French people, and the Iberians, the ancestors of today's Spanish and Portuguese people, to the effect that when they brewed beer, there was this foam that developed. The technical name for that foam is barm. And they took this barm and used it as leaven to make bread. So these are related. Ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, affluent people ate bread made from wheat, and poor people ate bread made from barley. The lower classes lived almost exclusively on bread. That was their fundamental sustenance. Bread was both a cultural unit and a unit of measure. To say that somebody had a lot of breads meant that they were wealthy. And workers, this was before money was invented. Workers were paid in bread and beer. In fact, you could say that the fuel that created the pyramids was bread and beer. Egyptian art has many depictions of bread, showing many shapes that were very creative. And like a lot of things in their tombs, they placed bread as food for the departed in the afterlife. Now, even though this part one of this presentation is primarily focused on the ancient world, I can't talk about Egypt without running things forward a few millennia to the current day. In today's Egypt, and by the way, Egypt is the largest Arab country. The population is over 110 million people. Bread is still a fundamental food for the people of modern Egypt. The Egyptian government has a subsidized bread program in which 64% of the populace participates. So that's well over 60 million people. And each participant can get up to 5 loaves of bread per day. Recently, and when I say recently, it's probably about 2 months before I'm speaking today, the government of Egypt raised the subsidized price of bread. So it's now 20 piastres. A piastre is a 100th of an Egyptian pound, which is their basic unit of currency. But 20 piastres is worth around 4 thousandths of a US dollar. And so this is what the participant in this program pays per loaf. And so what the participant pays is around 16% of the cost of production. The government subsidizes the rest by paying the bakers. This bread subsidy cost the Egyptian government $5.5 billion a year. Egypt, is still a significant agricultural land, but they produce 40% of the wheat that they consume. So the rest is imported. Now, where did I get these numbers? I got them from the United States Department of Agriculture. Why does the United States Department of Agriculture monitor and track all of this? It's because US farmers are huge suppliers of wheat to Egypt. To make up that difference between the 40% of their consumption that they produce and the rest of it, 60% comes from abroad, a lot of that from the United States. The most popular bread in today's Egypt is Aish Baldi. There's a photo there. I have not been able to find how big are these and how much do they weigh, but just sort of eyeballing it and guessing, it looks like they're a little bigger than a standard US hamburger bun. But the standard US hamburger bun is pretty light. There's a lot of air and not much substance. I expect that these loaves have a lot of substance in terms of the wheat. Well, that's modern Egypt. Let's look at Jewish life. Everybody knows the Jews spent a long time living in Egypt, and that's where they learned to bake bread. Bread was a major part of their diet. The best bread came from wheat. Poor people used barley for their bread. As we will see, this is a recurrent theme. Baking was first domestic. It was done by women at home. But over the course of time, as life got more urbanized, it was not convenient to have hot ovens and things in a small house or apartment. So baking got commercialized to the point that one source I read said that in Old Jerusalem, there was a whole street lined with bakeries. It was called Baker's Street. Now let's look at the Jewish scriptures. In the Jewish scriptures, there are 270 mentions of the Hebrew word lechem, which is generally translated as bread. And we're going to look at some examples. I can't go through all 270. Let's start. I'm not sure that there are any examples in Genesis, but the next book, Exodus, the famous account of the Jews' departure from Egypt and going to their homeland. And what happened was they were in a big hurry and they didn't have time for their bread to be leavened and rise. So they had unleavened bread. This is the basis for the celebration of Passover. It's a very significant part of Jewish life. The celebration of Passover, the bread has to be unleavened, and there can't be any leavening of any sort, no yeast or anything else anywhere around the house. Here's a photo of a Jewish family celebrating the Seder dinner, the focus of Passover. And there you see, in a very central, noticeable place in the middle of the table, are two stacks of unleavened bread, the matzah. Very, very important and significant. Well, of course, they have other things that are part of the tradition, including there's always wine, which is always nice to go with bread. Now, I have read some reports by some scholars who say that what's going on here is not just a matter of logistics. It's not just a matter of people departing in a hurry and not having time to have their dough rise. Because in those days, I mean, now we understand the process of leavening by yeast and other agents. We understand the biology, we understand the chemistry, but in those days it was mysterious. And, mysterious is next door to spooky, and spooky is next door to evil, and evil is next door to impure. So maybe there's something else going on here at Passover that for a special sacred occasion, you need to avoid leaven because of its uncertain status. I'll put it that way. Well, anyway, that's Passover. Here's some other examples of the reference in the Jewish scriptures to the Hebrew word lechem, tobit, give of your bread to the hungry, and of your clothing to the naked, give all your surplus to charity. And the Psalms, you, that's God, you cause the grass to grow for the cattle, and plants for people, and bread to strengthen the human heart. Another psalm, for the Lord has chosen Zion. And he says, this is my resting place forever. I will abundantly bless its provisions. I will satisfy its poor with bread. And then this quote from Proverbs, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be full of gravel. In that verse, you could really translate the Hebrew word lechem not just by bread, but wealth. Wealth gained by deceit is sweet, but afterwards it won't be. We move to ancient Greece. Greece is in the Mediterranean world. It has a diverse ecology and climate with diverse sources of food. In earlier times, the Greeks mostly ate flat barley cakes, but by the end of the 6th century BC, they became more agrarian, and baked leaven wheat bread became popular and a staple. By several centuries BC, the baking of bread moved away or had moved away from domestic life, and commercial bakeries were established. The Greeks were very focused on the importance of agriculture and grain, and they had a goddess, Demeter, devoted to these subjects. She was the subject of an important cult. They had a major festival, the Thesmophoria, celebrated in autumn exclusively by women to promote the fertility of the soil, to produce lots of grain, so there would be lots of grain to provide lots of bread for the people. We move further west and down the time scale to ancient Rome. In Rome, there's also a diversity of ecology and climate. They're part of the Mediterranean world. Like Greece, the Romans, unlike the Egyptians, these Egyptian workers, they had to live on bread and beer, and maybe a few vegetables were provided. But in the Mediterranean world, both in ancient Greece and Rome, they had a lot of things. Bread was a major part of their diet, but they had fruits and vegetables and cheese and eggs, and they didn't eat much meat, but they had plenty of fish and other seafood. So it was quite a diverse diet, but still focused on bread. Baked bread was important in Rome. Bread made with wheat was greatly preferred. By the time of the classic period of Rome, barley wasn't much around anymore in that area, although I have read that they did use barley to make bread to feed to prisoners. So it was effectively a punishment, at least there in the center of the empire. Like these other places, The production of bread was originally domestic, it then became commercial. The Romans turned bread into an art. We have all kinds of evidence that they had all kinds of different bread, different shapes, with different flavors, with fruit and nuts and seeds, and it was just a very big deal. The Romans had large and sophisticated ovens. Here's a photo of what one of them looked like. Just look at the size of that. And there in the middle, that slab, it's probably a piece of granite. The rest of the oven looks like it's made from brick. And you see the hole in the bottom underneath the slab. That was where the fuel was put, and there's a hole in the back where heat can come in. In those days, most ovens seem to have had an open front. So they were enclosed, on the bottom, the top, the sides, the back, but the front was open. And as an example, everybody knows the story of Pompeii, the city near Naples that was destroyed in 79 AD. Most people think, well, it was the explosion or the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius. Literally, as I have been preparing this presentation, there have been some stories to the effect that before the eruption, there was a huge earthquake that did terrible damage to Pompeii. And all the ash and dust and all of that from the eruption of the volcano, it was almost the icing on the cake. Well, not exactly. But anyway, it was destroyed. Well, it's been extensively excavated, and the estimates of the population of Pompeii vary from 10,000 people to 20,000 people. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say the population was there in the middle, 15,000. Well, over 30 bakeries have been excavated. So that's, in round numbers, one bakery for every 500 people. Assume that each household had 5 people. So that's one bakery for 100 households. It sounds like they were producing a lot of bread and consuming a lot of bread. The Romans, like the Greeks, they had a goddess of agriculture and grain. The Romans called her Ceres. Her name is the origin of the English word cereal. And in any event, they had a big festival in her honor in April of every year called, well, in Latin, called Carialia. They had theatrical performances. They had horse races in the Circus Maximus. It was a big deal, again, to promote fertility. Lots of grain, lots of bread. The government of Rome, for quite some time, had a program to distribute grain to the urban poor. This was called frumentatio. They gave out grain as such, and people then would have to turn it into flour and then have the flour turned into bread. But it's sort of like the antecedent of today's programs like food stamps and all to help support the sustenance of the poor. We now turn to Christianity, which grew out of the Roman Empire. Christianity arose in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where the common language, well, the common language in Italy was Latin, but the common language in the eastern part of the empire was Greek. The Christian scriptures were originally written in Greek, and they contain 77 mentions of the Greek word artos, which is generally translated as bread. Here are some examples. The first one requires no explanation. The Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. The next one is the account in three of the Gospels that's referred to as the multiplication of loaves and fish. This is the account where Jesus left the city and went out to the countryside and was followed by a lot of people. By some accounts, maybe as many as 5,000. And turns out everybody got hungry. And so his disciples wondered, is there something we can do to feed all these people? Well, there were there was a small amount of food on hand, a few loaves of bread and a few fish. And the account is that the prophet took these and multiplied them so that there was enough food for all these people. Well, the accounts in Matthew and Mark just refer to loaves of bread. The account in John is a little different. The disciples note that there was a boy there who had 5 loaves of bread made of barley. Think about that. What did I tell you about the difference between more affluent people eating bread made from wheat and ordinary people eating bread made from barley? So this tells you this multitude, they were very ordinary people, and this was the nature of their sustenance. Here we have the institution of the Eucharist. Accounts in 3 Gospels reporting that during the time of the unleavened bread, in other words, at the time when the Jews were celebrating Passover, Jesus and his disciples gathered. And the account goes, at least according to Matthew, now as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And here is a photo of Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting, The Last Supper, depicting this. Well, I'm not going to go into the religious aspects of this, but just to point out the focus here on bread, and you can see if you look at the painting carefully, there are these little loaves of bread there on the table. We come to the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 35. Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." I just quote this one verse. It's the beginning of 24 verses from verse 35 to verse 59 there in John 6 about this subject of bread and Jesus identifying himself as bread. Again, I'm not going into the religious aspects of this, but I just want to point out the significance, the important symbolic significance of bread in the Christian religion, just as in previous slides I talked about the importance of bread in the Jewish religion. I want to recap some common themes. The first is bread in ancient times, at least in this part of the world, was a major source of human sustenance. There was social stratification of bread. Wheat bread for the more affluent, bread made from barley for people without many means. The commercialization of baking bread going from a household task performed by women to commercial bakeries run by men, and the symbolic meaning of bread in Judaism and Christianity. I'm going to take off my hat as a sort of cultural historian and put on my hat as a linguist, and I want to talk about words for bread. And I'm not going to survey the whole world, that would be too complicated. I'm going to talk about the Indo European language family. The Indo European languages originated maybe 6,000 years ago, probably in what are called the Pontic steppes of Central Asia, north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Many features of the original language, which is referred to as Proto Indo European, have been reconstructed. I say reconstructed because we have no records of the original language. We have records of successor languages. But anyway, these reconstructions, we have a pretty good idea of how this original language was pronounced in terms of its vowels and consonants. We have a pretty good idea of what its grammar was like in terms of the forms of words, using prefixes and suffixes and other means to add nuances of meaning like singular and plural and present tense and past tense and that sort of thing. And we have been able to reconstruct a lot of vocabulary from this ancient proto language, numerals, kinship terms, a lot of basic nouns and verbs. But it is not possible to reconstruct a common Indo European source word for bread. Why is this? Well, the early Indo European people have been described as semi nomadic pastoralists. Well, that's a big mouthful. It sort of means, well, they had domesticated animals, so they herded animals, they were pastoralists, and they were semi nomadic, meaning they moved around some, maybe not just, every week or every month, but they moved around some. But at the same time, they had some knowledge of agriculture. So what happened was, as the different subgroups split and moved elsewhere, they developed different words for bread. There was one group that went east, but most of them went west towards Europe and south towards what is now Iran and Afghanistan and India. Let's start out by looking at the Germanic language family, including English. And let's look at Old English, which was spoken, well, in England. The classic version of it around 1200 years ago. The basic word in Old English for bread was hlaf, which is the ancestor of the modern English word loaf. And for example, when they translated the Bible into Old English, well, they started from Jerome's Latin version called the Vulgate. And in that version, the Latin word for bread is panis. We'll get to that later. They translated the Latin word panis with the Old English word hlaf. So literally, in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, the word they used was hlaf. Many people may not know this, but the modern English word Lord goes back to an Old English compound noun, hlafwerd, literally meaning loaf ward or guardian of the bread. It got contracted to hlaverd at some point and then ended up in modern English as Lord. So, Lord originally meant the guardian of the bread. The modern English word bread has an uncertain origin. There was an Old English word bread, meaning morsel or crumb, and it's maybe related to the verb brewan, meaning to brew, um, which itself may go back to a Proto-Indo-European root, brewa, meaning to boil or bubble or something like that, but we don't quite know. But at some point in time, these words kind of switched meaning so that the original bread, meaning morsel or crumb, came to mean the substance, and the original word hlaf, meaning the substance, came to mean a shape of the substance. The Slavic languages, according to common theory, took the word for bread from the Germanic languages. So, for example, you have the Russian word for bread, chlieb, which apparently comes from Germanic. The Latin word for bread is panis, Latin being the source of the modern Romance languages. So that's the source of Spanish pan, Italian pane, and French pain. And it's maybe related to the verb pascor, which means to feed or to graze. And people have related this to the Proto-Indo-European root pa, meaning to protect or feed. So maybe panis originally meant food, but the meaning got narrowed to bread, maybe. The Greek word for bread, we already mentioned this, is artos. The origin is unclear. We simply don't know where it came from. Sanskrit, the word for bread is rotika, and we don't know where that came from either. All right, here are some selected references if you want to pursue these subjects. Here is how you can contact me if you have comments or questions or criticisms or any other communications. Here are some previous presentations that I've made like this if you're interested in any of these subjects. And so at this point, I will ask you to continue this study of bread by going to part 2 of my presentation, where I talk about bread in the modern world, especially France and Germany and the United States. Thank you.